you guys going? You're all thoroughly geeked out? How the brains still absorb a little bit of information? Right.
Testing. Right. Up next is Dr. Anastasia Boulais. She is a medical resident in sunny Australia, and she and her partner Jamie Scott run Whole 9 South Pacific Foundation of Nutrition workshops in association with Dallas and Melissa Hartwig. And she'll be speaking today on sun exposure and the risk of melanoma. Please welcome Dr. Boulais.
Guys, we're going to talk about melanoma today. Just to get you started, this is about 100 steps from my house. Don't hate me for it. This looks beautiful, and as you can see, this is the Pacific Ocean on the other side, and this is where our sun comes up. It comes out of the Pacific Ocean rather than sets in it, and that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about sunlight. I think, as you probably know, in this community, we consider ourselves quite progressive. Sometimes a little bit revolutionary, sometimes a little bit rebellious. And with that comes a certain skepticism of some of the central tenets of the conventional wisdom. So when it comes to things like that, we kind of think that's probably not the case. We are quite naturally skeptical of some of those messages. But it causes heart attacks. I think, yeah, probably not so much. But ask yourself, is that evil orb in the sky is out to give you lethal cancer? And it's very easy to go, we're going to reject their hypothesis because it's probably the same as everything else that conventional wisdom tends to dish out for us. But the question is, do we tend to lurch to another extreme and maybe start using some of the fairly unhealthy practices and burning ourselves to the crisp while trying to reject that hypothesis? I think sometimes our natural skepticism is probably exaggerated by the fact that conventional wisdom can be so upfront and use so much hyperbole and appeal to emotion to send their message across. So this is actually a very popular health campaign in Australia about the dangers of sunlight, and it features this little melanoma cell that looks like a little monster with little tentacles that starts off as you tan and then spreads the black stuff all around your body and basically causes cancer. Kind of goes against some of the scientific principles that we know about. So let's talk about Australia. We have the dubious honour of being the world leader in melanoma. We're also a country that has the highest number of things that will kill you per capita. And yeah, having melanoma is probably one of those things. It's very important to make sure that we don't just refer to this condition as skin cancer. So you need to be very specific when you talk about melanoma, because the pathogenesis is quite different from the non-melanoma skin cancer. We have the highest incidence in the world. And we also know that Australia was actually the first country that introduced huge public health measures trying to protect people from melanoma and trying to reduce sun exposure. In the 1980s, we started the Slip, Slop, Slap campaign, which is a slip on a shirt, slop on sunscreen, slap on a hat. This is considered the most successful health campaign in Australian history. And as you can see in the point below, our melanoma rates have doubled between 1986 to 2006. So I guess we measure the effectiveness of the campaign by how reachable it is and how recognisable it is, not actually by the results. As we probably know in this community, there is a lot of argument that goes on between Does sunlight cause melanoma or it doesn't cause melanoma? And there's a few arguments that go both pro and against. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the against arguments. I'm not going to go through all of them. You can take your time reading them. I think the most striking ones when I talk to conventional medical practitioners is to point out that the incidence of melanoma is much lower in outdoor workers like farmers and construction workers than it is in office workers, especially with those with tertiary education. But as always in science, when we have these widely diverging arguments, a lot of people like to call it a paradox. I think of a paradox as just an admission that we actually don't know what's going on. So we're actually missing a few factors. So simplifying the question to does sunlight cause melanoma, to me it's a bit like saying does food cause heart disease? It's like, I don't know how to answer that. Is it a yes or a no? There's lots of factors involved. As Dallas Hartwood would say, context matters, yes? So we're going to start looking at that context a little bit more. So let's go back to basics. Ultraviolet light is part of the solar radiation that we receive, and we break it down by its wavelength into UVA, UVB, and UVC. UVA is the longest wavelength, and it penetrates the ozone layer in its entirety to hit the Earth's surface. UVB is a slightly shorter wavelength, so some of it gets absorbed by the ozone layer, and we'll talk about that a bit later on. UVC is the shortest, and in the ideal conditions, in its entirety, it's actually completely deflected from the Earth's surface. The majority of the sun rays that we receive are going to be of the UVA length, so about 95-96% of what hits the Earth's surface is actually UVA. As I mentioned, it's longer, and because it's longer, it has a much deeper skin penetration. So it doesn't just hit the epidermis, the very top layer of the skin, but it goes down to the dermis, and as you can see in this picture, it can actually go down as far as hypodermis underneath and hit some of the capillaries. And that has an implication for what it can do to the elements in the blood. It has a low erythema potential, so you actually have to be exposed to a lot more UVA to burn than to UVB. The particular tan that UVA causes is very interesting. We think of tan automatically as something that has melanin, that's been produced by melanin. But in fact, the UVA tan is produced by oxidation of melanin precursors. So there is actually no increase in the total melanin content for when you get specifically UVA tan. And it's also tan that causes the immediate reaction. You know when you go out in the sun and you come back home in the afternoon and you have a tan line, not the redness but a slight tan line when you take your t-shirt off, that's UVA. So it can start minutes to hours after being exposed and last days to weeks. A couple of other things about UVA. UVA has the potential to cause indirect DNA damage by producing oxidative stress via free radicals. Because you don't have the increase in melanin content, it doesn't provide any significant photoprotection. So you don't get protected from further exposure via the UVA. We normally think about UV radiation as something that helps us make vitamin D, but in fact, the UVA are the rays that specifically break down vitamin D when it is bound to vitamin D receptors. And you would think it's a little bit counterintuitive, but perhaps this is one of nature's ways to self-regulate vitamin D production. As you probably know very well, it is very hard to overdose of vitamin D if you're getting it from the sun as opposed to a pill. A couple of other things that induces nitric oxide formation. There's been some a study recently about this playing a role in blood pressure regulation. And also inhibits some of the UVB-induced effects. So this is just a reminder of what free radicals look like. So the free radicals produced in mitochondria as part of the oxidative phosphorylation can be enhanced by the UVA photons, and that can result in protein damage, lipid damage, but in this case we're specifically interested in DNA damage because that carries the most implication for melanoma. Interesting fact, when you think about sunbeds mostly carry UVA, and you can see it from a manufacturer's point of view. You know that UVA is going to give you less redness and it's going to give you an immediate tan. So what a better way to give people immediate satisfaction is to give them this tan that is not going to give them too much burning by the intensity. So sunbeds give off about 5 to 10 times more. They're very poorly regulated, so it's actually really hard to tell. A recent meta-analysis in BMJ actually looked at different studies assessing the damage and the role of sunbeds in melanoma, and the overall relative risk of exposure to sunbed at some point in your life is 1.2. The risk under the age of 35, if you've been exposed to a sunbed under the age of 35, is 1.7. So you have an increase of 20% or 70%. Let's talk about UVB. So UVB is shorter wavelength and hence poorer skin penetration. In fact, because it's a shorter wavelength, UVB gets stuck on the way. It either gets stuck by going through the ozone layer, it gets absorbed by surfaces like glass, so you will not be getting UVB through an office window or a car window, and obviously clothing. I'll talk about the ozone layer a little bit later on, but the UVB is the particular wavelength that produces a tan that is produced via actual increase in melanin content. And because you have this melanin produced by the melanin precursors, it gives you a delayed tan, so you don't get the colour straight away, you get the colour 3 to 7 days later, but it lasts much longer. It can last for weeks. UVB radiation, unlike UVA, it is so active, if it does end up penetrating and going into DNA, going to the nucleus, it's going to cause direct DNA damage. It forms a couple of particular products, and as you can see in the picture here, it basically breaks off some of the bonds and forms particular products called CPD and 6,4-PP. The delayed tan via the melanin gives you a degree of photoprotection that's going to protect you from further direct DNA damage. UVB is also a wavelength that causes the most skin adaptation. So it's very good at making the skin a little bit thicker in a particular process called hyperkeratosis and thickening of stratum corneum. And it's the UVB that is responsible for vitamin D. So this simple diagram that you don't have to memorize basically demonstrates the UV rays basically hitting the cell, causing some sort of cellular change that we're not going to go through, the end result of which is the DNA damage, but also the formation of melanin. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about that ozone layer and why it is important and how it plays into what we're getting in terms of UVB. As you can imagine, the radiation from the sun always hits the Earth indirectly. So we are never, apart from the time when you're at the equator at midday, you never get the exact angle. So hence, we are going to have slightly different content of UV depending where you are. So it's going to depend on the ozone concentration, it's going to depend on the elevation, so whether you are at the sea level or whether you're up in the mountains. And it's going to depend on this particular thing called solar zenith angle. And I'm going to go through this in a second. So the amount of UVB that you're going to get is going to differ with latitude, it's going to differ with time of the year and time of the day. That has implication of how much vitamin D you're making at any given time. Just to give you a very, very simple rule to remember, if your shadow is longer than your height, then the solar zenith angle is probably quite low, which means that you're probably not making any vitamin D at all. So that's just to demonstrate that. As you can see, if the sun was directly above the Earth at the solar zenith angle of 0, you're going to get the most penetration. If the sun is lower down on the horizon, the rays have to travel through more ozone, and hence more of it gets absorbed. Unfortunately, we actually still don't know which wavelength causes melanoma, whether it's the indirect DNA damage from the UVA or direct DNA damage from UVB. The recent review quote says that the available evidence points away from pyramid and diamond formation by UVB and towards oxidative damage caused by UVA. So we're starting to lean towards UVA being more of a player in melanoma. But of course, if we went out in the sun and got melanoma, we probably would be here. So to protect us from that, we have a whole host of different protection mechanisms, and I'll go through those. One of the important ones is actually melatonin. And you probably know melatonin is a hormone that helps you to go to sleep. And a lot of people think of melatonin as something that's just produced in your brain and the pineal gland. Well, in fact, it's produced in many other organs, including skin. And it's a very strong antioxidant. So a lot of those free radicals that you're going to be producing by the sun exposure are going to be cleaned up by melatonin. So think about all the ways that we're going to disrupt the melatonin production in our modern life, and think about the implications of that. The other interesting fact is that there are other mechanisms by which we protect ourselves from DNA damage, and a lot of them are also related to circadian rhythms. This particular protein, which is a critical protein and actually a rate-limiting factor in DNA repair, is very much regulated by circadian rhythm. And in this particular study in mice, the mice that were exposed in a 4 p.m. group repaired their DNA damage from UV a lot faster than the ones who were exposed at 4 a.m. We hypothesize that in humans, this actually correlates with morning hours up to noon, which is where you have the best DNA damage repair. So circadian rhythm is a good thing. You want to make sure that you're living in accordance with those light-dark cycles. So thinking back towards melanoma, thinking back towards the factors that are going to be influencing you, if you increase the UVA to UVB ratio, we're starting to see that this is actually a bit of a problem when it comes to activating our normal repair. Sure, you're going to have a little bit less burning, but you're going to have an increased oxidative stress with more UVA and less UVB, less melanin production, which is protective. You're going to have less vitamin D production and more vitamin D breakdown, and you don't have that protective skin adaptation. How does it apply to real life? So think about a sunbed and exposure to UVA in the solariums. Also, going out in the sun in the afternoon, going out in the sun at 4 o'clock, which is the genuine message, stay away from the sun around midday, go out in the afternoon. And this could be the time when your body is actually not very well prepared. You're getting mostly UVA, you're not getting a lot of UVB. Being indoor, so thinking about sitting next to a window and you're getting a lot of UVB through that office window, you're not getting any UVA, and you're not getting any UVB at all. And finally, sunscreens. The majority of sunscreens that we have been exposed to for the last 20 years are geared towards protecting you against burning. Therefore, they mostly protect you against UVB. So you're getting no UVB at all, and you're getting a hit of UVA and you're out in the sun for a longer period of times because you don't have that negative feedback of burning. Any other issues? Definitely. So think about what you put in your mouth, and what your diet contains is actually going to play a huge role in your ability to repair some of the cancer damage. So we know that antioxidants have been found to be very effective in both in vitro studies, in epidemiological studies, and in human randomized control studies that obviously didn't look at melanoma but looked at erythema. And there's a lovely examples of that, and I have good news for you: tea and coffee and chocolate. So yes, they are all good things for protecting you against burning and protecting you against melanoma. On the flip side of that, we have found that there is an increased risk if your diet contains high levels of polyunsaturated fatty acids. And the relative risk is, depending on the study that you look at, is between 2 and 4. In particular, the authors of a couple of studies isolated high linoleic acid, and also one of the Norwegian studies isolated cod liver oil as a factor in that particular epidemiological study. And if you compare the ranges, remember the sunbeds, they were giving you a relative ratio of about 1.2. Here, with a dietary change, you're getting the relative ratios of 2 to 4. So this is how much higher risk of melanoma you have if you have an adequate diet. This is probably the land of a little bit more conjecture. We don't know this for sure, whether the physiological stress is going to contribute to your risk of melanoma, but there is at least one study that shows that marathon runners had increased number of atypical nevi, so the moles that carry a high risk of melanoma. And when they controlled for the time that those runners spent in the sun, they found that those who had higher training heart rates, higher training velocity, and rated themselves as a higher physical strain index had this increased number of moles. Don't know the mechanism. Maybe cortisol plays into it, maybe the overall dose of oxidative stress. Maybe they're not repairing that damage adequately because the body is trying to repair some of the other damage that they're causing by their high training. And I'm sure that we all know that there are other ways of physical activity that you can do that are probably not going to be particularly stressful for the body. So, the overall message that we're currently receiving from our conventional sort of authorities that there is nothing healthy about a tan, as you're starting to see, it's probably not as simple as that. So the sun is not going to cause melanoma just because you're out there. Sure, there is a genetic risk, but at the same time, we cannot dismiss the sunlight as a causative factor. But within the context of few more things, you can potentially modify your risk. How can you ensure that you have melanoma? You can have high intake of pro-oxidant foods like polyunsaturated fatty acids. You can ignore eating fruits and vegetables. You can stay up all night and maybe be a shift worker, maybe not go out during the day. Ensure higher UVA to UVB ratio. Don't care too much about your low vitamin D status and have a constant physiological stress. So this is probably a recipe for melanoma in susceptible individuals. So what do? You know your risk. So know your family history, know your skin colour, know how much at risk you are. Fair skin, red hair, blue or green eyes with a family history has a slightly higher risk. But then there are other things that you can do, eating well, sleeping better, enjoying movement rather than punishing yourself with exercise day in and day out. Manage your stress level. You can add a smart sun exposure to that and light up your ducks in a row. This is my talk. Thank you very much for being here. Do you have any questions?
Unfortunately, we don't have time.
Do we have time?
No, we're a little
No time for questions. Guys, you can catch me at the back if you have any questions. Thank you.